The Brooch Conspiracy by Agatha Christie. The house was eerily quiet, a stillness that clung to the corners of every room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was a peaceful evening, the kind where secrets seemed to gather like smoke in the air. And yet, Edna stood in the doorway of Miss Marple's sitting room, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron, her eyes darting nervously around the room. It wasn't the usual maid's call for attention. There was something different in the way she hovered, a hesitation that spoke louder than any words could. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling with urgency, I need to speak with you. If you have a moment, it's about something serious." Miss Marple, perched in her favorite chair, a book resting in her lap, looked up with a keen eye. She had lived long enough to recognize when something wasn't quite right. Edna's voice, strained and tight, carried with it an undeniable sense of impending trouble. "Of course, Edna," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm, but with a hint of curiosity. "Come in and close the door. Let me hear what's on your mind." The door clicked shut behind Edna, and she stepped inside, her movements stiff, almost robotic. Her face was pale, and her eyes, a mixture of fear and shame, kept darting around, as though she expected someone, or something, to jump out from the shadows. She swallowed hard before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about my cousin, Gladys." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly, and her mind began to tick, processing the situation. "Gladys? What has happened now?" she asked, her voice steady, though a faint concern flickered in her eyes. Edna shook her head vigorously, the words spilling out in a rush. No, nothing terrible like that. It's just she's lost her place, and she's distraught, Miss Marple, completely beside herself." Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. Lost her place? But wasn't she employed at Old Hall with Mrs. Skinner? Yes, that's right," Edna said quickly, almost stumbling over her words. "But, well, that's where it all started. Mrs. Skinner's brooch went missing. It caused such a fuss, Miss Marple, like a storm rolling in. Gladys, poor girl, she helped search the whole house, every nook and cranny, but it was all for nothing." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, sensing the familiar scent of drama in the air. "And I take it, the brooch turned up in a most inconvenient place, just as these things tend to?" she said, her voice smooth, like someone who had seen this kind of thing unfold 100 times before. Edna nodded, her hands wringing together. "Exactly. It was found in a drawer, buried at the back, but by then it was too late. Miss Skinner had already made up her mind. The very next day a plate got broken. Nothing serious, just an accident. But Miss Skinner, she took it as an excuse, and just like that, Gladys was out of a job. A month's notice, she told her, just like that." Miss Marple's eyes darkened, her sharp mind already connecting the dots. "And Gladys, feeling unfairly blamed, now believes that the loss of the brooch has tarnished her reputation?" "Yes, madam," Edna cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her concern. "She's terrified, Miss Marple. Terrified that people will think she's a thief, that the gossip will spread like wildfire. She says she can't go on like this, with everyone looking at her like she's guilty of something she didn't do." Miss Marple's expression softened just slightly, her mind already formulating the next steps. "Poor girl," she murmured, but there was a steely resolve in her tone. "No one should have to suffer for something they didn't do, and where there's smoke, there's often fire. But I suspect, Edna, this fire may not be quite what it appears." Edna, still standing near the door, nodded in desperate agreement. "Please, Miss Marple, can you help her? Can you make things right?" Miss Marple set her book aside, her eyes glinting with the promise of a mystery to be unraveled. "We'll see to it, Edna. Trust me. I've dealt with far worse than this, and I always find the truth, no matter how cleverly it's hidden." As Edna left the room, a shiver of excitement ran through Miss Marple. A new puzzle had presented itself, and though the pieces were still scattered, she knew the solution would reveal itself soon enough. After all, no one ever fooled Miss Marple. Not for long. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind working quickly. "And she's upset naturally," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Well, I'll tell you what. I'm heading that way this afternoon. I'll have a word with Mrs. Skinner." Edna's eyes lit up, relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank you, madam, thank you." The conversation swirled with tension as Miss Lavinia Skinner scowled, clearly annoyed by the way things were going. "It's just so difficult these days, you know. Finding good help, especially girls willing to come to the country." Her voice was sharp as she clucked her tongue. "I don't know if Miss Skinner really thought it wise to let Gladys go." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "Indeed, it's so rare to find anyone decent for the job. You must be finding it difficult yourselves." "Well, you'd be surprised," Miss Lavinia huffed. "The Deos haven't got anyone, but honestly, I can't blame them. The whole household is a mess. Always quarreling, jazz music blasting till all hours of the night, meals at odd times. That girl, Miss Deo, doesn't know the first thing about housekeeping. I pity her husband, truly." Miss Marple sat quietly, carefully assessing the situation. "It's a shame, really, but then again, the Lynns, they're another story. They've just lost their maid, and I can't say I blame her. The judge is impossible, always demanding his ch hazri, as he calls it, at 6 in the morning. Mrs. Lynn is no better, fussing all the time." I know," Miss Lavinia replied, rubbing her temples. "And then there's Mrs. Carmichael's Janet. She's been a fixture in the village for years, but she's absolutely insufferable, bullying the old lady all the time. Honestly, Miss Marple, some people simply shouldn't be allowed near a household." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement as she gently prodded. "Don't you think, then, you might reconsider your decision about Gladys? She really is a nice girl, I assure you. Honest, dependable, a far cry from the others." Miss Lavinia shook her head vehemently, her thin lips pressing together in frustration. "I've got my reasons, Miss Marple. You don't understand." The older woman nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, the brooch. That's what this is about, isn't it? Tell me, Miss Lavinia, who's been spreading rumors about Gladys?" Miss Lavinia stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "The girl herself, of course. I've heard enough to be almost certain she took the brooch. She must have gotten scared and then put it back, hoping no one would notice. But of course, no one can say anything unless they're absolutely sure." Miss Marple didn't push further, her gaze softening. "Well, perhaps it's time to change the subject. Do take me to see Miss Emily. I'm sure it would do her good." Miss Lavinia led her guest to a darkened room, knocking softly before entering. The air was thick with the faint, musty odor of stale biscuits and cologne. Inside, Miss Emily Skinner lay on her bed, a figure so frail she seemed to be slowly fading into the surroundings. Her grayish-yellow hair was wrapped in a messy bun that looked more like a bird's nest than anything else. The room itself was dim, with half-drawn blinds filtering out most of the light, adding to the sense of suffocating gloom. "Oh, Miss Marple," Emily croaked in a weak voice. "It's one of my bad days, you see. The worst part about being unwell, dear, is knowing what a burden you are to everyone around you. Lavinia is so good to me, so patient." She paused to cough delicately. "I do so hate causing trouble, but if only my hot water bottle could be filled in the exact way I like, Not too full, but enough to give me comfort. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her expression soft but firm. Of course, dear, I'll take care of it. She emptied a bit of the water from the bottle as Miss Emily continued, oblivious to the simplicity of the solution. There are no rusks in the house, I suppose? Emily asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. No, I'm afraid not, Miss Marple replied gently, but we'll manage. Miss Emily sighed. No matter, I suppose I can do without. I feel so terribly weak today. Oysters are said to be so nourishing, but getting them now, at this time of day, I could hardly ask for that. Don't trouble yourself, Miss Marple replied. You need to rest. We'll sort things out for you. Lavinia, looking almost relieved to have Miss Marple take charge, exited the room, mumbling something about heading to the village to take care of errands. Miss Marple lingered for a moment, watching Emily with a mix of compassion and exasperation. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with Edna in the kitchen, her brow furrowed. I'm afraid my visit didn't go as hoped. Miss Emily is certainly a character, but as for Gladys, it seems the rumors about her dishonesty are already spreading like wildfire. I overheard it at the post office just this afternoon. Miss Weatherby gave me the most cryptic warning. Edna looked uneasy. What do you think, Miss Marple? Miss Marple shook her head thoughtfully. Well, it's clear they'll have a difficult time replacing Gladys. Servants these days simply won't go to Old Hall, not with the gossip that's already in circulation. And once people get that idea in their heads, it's hard to shake. The Skinners might find themselves in a real bind, and perhaps, just maybe, Miss Emily will have to roll up her sleeves and do something for herself. As the conversation wound down, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a touch of satisfaction. In the world of gossip and secrets, a sharp mind like hers was always one step ahead. By all accounts, Mary Higgins was the ideal maid. Her references were impeccable, and the glowing recommendation she had received could not have been more flattering. A 3-year reference was handed over, vouching for her dedication and skill, and it was clear to everyone that she was a rare find. She preferred the quiet of the countryside, and, in a curious turn, even asked for lower wages than Gladys had. Miss Lavinia was positively thrilled by her good fortune. I truly feel we've been most fortunate, she confessed. But Miss Marple, as always, wasn't easily swayed by surface appearances. Listening intently to Miss Lavinia's praise of her new maid, she remarked, It all seems too good to be true, doesn't it? Her words, though soft, carried a weight that set the stage for what was to come. Despite the whispers and predictions from the village of St. Mary Mead, who were certain the perfect paragon would turn out to be too good to last, Mary Higgins arrived on schedule. None of the ominous prophecies about her potential disappearance came true. To everyone's surprise, Mary's appearance in the village was impeccable. She arrived, as if on cue, in Reed's taxi, looking every bit the part, a model of respectability. Her appearance was indeed flawless. She was a well-presented woman, probably around 40, with neatly arranged black hair, rosy cheeks, and a plump figure that suggested both warmth and competence. She wore the uniform of a servant with grace, black dress, white apron, and cap, embodying the traditional image of a capable, trustworthy housemaid. It was the kind of look you would expect from the good, old-fashioned type of servant, Miss Marple observed later with a nod of approval. When Miss Marple next visited Old Hall, it was to arrange a stall for the vicarage's fundraising event. This time, it was Mary Higgins who answered the door. The maid's presence was commanding in its politeness, and her voice, calm and respectful, contrasted sharply with Gladys's brash tones. Miss Lavinia appeared far less harried than usual, her demeanor brighter and more composed than when she'd been plagued by domestic turmoil. I really feel I owe so much to Mary, Miss Lavinia admitted, her voice practically glowing with gratitude. "She's invaluable, cooks wonderfully, waits on us perfectly, and keeps everything in our flat immaculate. Mattresses turned over every other day, rooms always pristine. She's even wonderful with Emily." Miss Marple, who had a quiet knack for reading between the lines, asked about Emily, hoping to see past the rosy picture Miss Lavinia was painting. "Oh, poor dear," Miss Lavinia sighed. "She's been under the weather, you know. She can't help it, of course, but it does make things a little difficult. One moment she wants a dish cooked, then decides she can't eat it, only to ask for it again half an hour later. Everything gets ruined, and we have to start over. It's a lot of work, but Mary is patient. She's used to invalids, says she understands them." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, but her keen eyes missed nothing. "You are certainly fortunate," she said softly, but with a certain caution in her tone. "Mary seems almost too good to be true. I'd be careful if I were you." Miss Lavinia, brushing off the warning, simply smiled. "Oh, I assure you, I do everything to make her comfortable. I don't know what I'd do if she left, but I don't expect she will, not until she's ready to go anyway." Miss Marple studied her closely, her gaze intense. "Yes, well, people like Mary, sometimes they leave without a trace, don't they?" Miss Lavinia didn't quite grasp the full weight of the statement, but she carried on, oblivious to the subtle warning. Later, as Miss Marple helped Miss Lavinia into her coat and handed her umbrella, a small incident occurred. Miss Marple dropped the umbrella, tried to pick it up, but in the process her bag tumbled open, spilling its contents onto the floor. It was nothing out of the ordinary, a handkerchief, an engagement book, a leather purse. But there was also a small striped piece of peppermint rock. Miss Marple, slightly flustered, said, "Oh dear, that must have been Mrs. Clement's little boy. He was sucking on it, I remember. He must have put it inside when he took my bag to play with." Mary, ever the picture of discretion, calmly retrieved the items, offering to clean the sticky candy. She didn't bat an eyelash, her expression as neutral as always. A week passed, and the village was subjected to a constant stream of Miss Lavinia's glowing accounts of Mary's perfect service. But then, on the 11th day, everything changed. The village was stunned when it was revealed that Mary, the supposedly perfect maid, had disappeared without a trace. Her bed was untouched, and the front door was ajar, suggesting she had slipped out quietly during the night. But that wasn't all. The real shock came when it was discovered that not only had Mary vanished, but so had a significant amount of jewelry. 2 brooches and 5 rings from Miss Lavinia, and more from Miss Emily. It didn't stop there. Other residents of St. Mary Mead began to report missing valuables: young Mrs. Diaz's diamonds and furs, the judge's and his wife's jewelry, and Mrs. Carmichael's prized collection of gems and a substantial sum of money. It was clear that Mary had had the keys to all the flats, and the thefts were carefully planned. The village, which had once been so enamored with Mary's saintly reputation, was now buzzing with gossip. How could they have missed the obvious? Mary had been nothing more than a common thief all along. The agency that had vouched for her credentials was equally baffled. It turned out that the Mary Higgins they had checked had never existed. Miss Marple, who had sensed something was amiss from the beginning, quietly shook her head as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. It seemed that sometimes the perfect facade hid the darkest secrets. It was eventually revealed that Mary Higgins was not the perfect maid she appeared to be. She had been living a double life. The name Mary Higgins had been a cover, borrowed from a legitimate servant who had worked for a bona fide sister of a dean. The real Mary Higgins, however, was quietly living her life in Cornwall. It was a brilliant con, as clever as it was daring. Inspector Slack, though confident in his abilities, was forced to admit that the woman behind the deception had to be working with a gang. He couldn't deny the striking similarities to a case in Northumberland the year before. Jewelry gone missing, suspects slipping through their fingers. But Inspector Slack wasn't one to give up easily. "We'll do better this time," he said, though his optimism seemed to falter with each passing week. Mary Higgins remained triumphantly at large. As days turned to weeks, Miss Lavinia grew tearful and distraught, while Miss Emily's health seemed to deteriorate with every passing day. Alarmed by her worsening condition, Miss Emily even called for Dr. Hawk. The entire village was left in suspense, waiting to hear the doctor's opinion on her ill health. However, the gossip machine was already in full swing. It was Mr. Meek, the chemist's assistant, who inadvertently provided the first clue. His casual conversation with Clara, Mrs. Price Ridley's maid, revealed that Dr. Hawk had prescribed a mixture of asapa and valerian, two common ingredients used to treat malingerers in the army. A sly smile passed through Miss Marple's face as she absorbed this detail. Soon after, Miss Emily, eager to escape the prying eyes of the local doctor, announced her decision to seek the care of a specialist in London. "It's only fair to Lavinia," she claimed. The flat was promptly put up for subletting. And just when things couldn't get any more complicated, Miss Marple, looking rather flustered, found herself heading to the police station in Much Benham to speak with Inspector Slack. Though Slack didn't hold Miss Marple in particularly high regard, he knew better than to ignore her when she called. With a grunt, he greeted her. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. What can I do for you?" Miss Marple, ever so polite but clearly hesitant, began her speech. "Oh dear, I hope I can put this properly," she said, her words trailing off as she tried to make sense of her thoughts. "It's difficult, you know, to explain oneself, not having been taught in the modern style, as one would say." Inspector Slack, half trying to mask his impatience, shot back a quick remark, asking if she intended to talk about smut. Miss Marple quickly dismissed the notion and instead steered the conversation toward the missing maid, Mary Higgins. "Mary Higgins, you say?" Inspector Slack scoffed. "The second maid, not Gladys, but really just as impertinent, too pleased with herself, but strictly honest, mind you, no charge against her." Miss Marple, unfazed, replied calmly, "No charge yet, but it's what makes it worse. You see, people will go on thinking things, and we all know how damaging rumors can be. What I really mean is, the important thing is to find Mary Higgins." Inspector Slack, still skeptical, asked, "Have you got any ideas?" Miss Marple nodded. "As a matter of fact, I do. Tell me, Inspector, are fingerprints of no use to you?" Slack's face hardened for a moment before he replied, "Ah, that's where she was too clever for us. She worked mostly with rubber gloves or housemaid's gloves, wiped everything clean, nothing left behind, no fingerprints at all. But if you had her prints, would it help?" "It might," Miss Marple said, pulling out a small cardboard box from her bag. Inside, wrapped in cotton wool, was a small mirror. "From my handbag," she explained. "The maid's prints are on it. They should be satisfactory." Inspector Slack stared at the object in her hand, taking in the sticky substance that covered it. "Did you get her fingerprints on purpose?" he asked, his voice rising with suspicion. "Well," Miss Marple responded with a sly smile, "it did strike me that she was a little too perfect to be true. I told Miss Lavinia so, but she simply wouldn't listen. You know, Inspector, I don't believe in paragons. Most of us have faults, and domestic service has a way of exposing them very quickly." "Well, I'm obliged to you, Miss Marple," said Inspector Slack, recovering his composure. "We'll send these off to the yard and see what they make of them." As Miss Marple turned to leave, She gave him a pointed look, her head tilted slightly to one side. "You wouldn't consider." Inspector Slack hesitated, feeling the weight of her gaze. "Consider what?" Miss Marple simply smiled, her eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction. The game had just begun. "I suppose, Inspector, you might want to look a little nearer home," Miss Marple said, her tone casual but laced with something sharp. Slack raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple hesitated, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on her umbrella. "It's difficult to explain," she began. "But when you notice something peculiar, you can't ignore it. Often, these peculiar things are just the smallest trifles. I noticed something from the start, you see, about Gladys and that brooch. She's an honest girl, isn't she?" Slack scoffed slightly. "She didn't take the brooch, we know that." "Exactly," Miss Marple nodded. "So, why did Miss Skinner think she did?" "You know, Miss Skinner is no fool, far from it. But she was awfully quick to get rid of Gladys, wasn't she? A good servant, in a town where servants are hard to come by. Now that's peculiar, don't you think? It made me wonder a lot." Inspector Slack frowned, but stayed silent, letting her continue. "And then there's Miss Emily," Miss Marple pressed on. "She's a hypochondriac, yes, but she's the first hypochondriac I've ever known who doesn't send for some doctor or another right away. Hypochondriacs love doctors, you see." Slack felt his patience start to fray. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" She leaned forward slightly, eyes sharp. "I'm suggesting that Miss Lavinia and Miss Emily are both peculiar people. Miss Emily spends all her time in a dark room, practically a recluse. And her hair, well, if that's not a wig, I'll eat my own back switch." Inspector Slack's face flushed slightly, but Miss Marple wasn't finished. "And what I'm telling you," she went on, her voice firm, "is that it's entirely possible for a thin, pale, gray-haired woman with a whiny voice to be the same person as a plump, rosy-cheeked woman with black hair. The key is nobody, not a single person, saw Miss Emily and Mary Higgins together at the same time. Plenty of time to get impressions of all the keys, learn about the other tenants, and then, poof, get rid of the local girl." Slack stared at her, trying to piece things together. "Think about it," Miss Marple continued, her eyes glittering. "One night, Miss Emily goes for a brisk walk across the country, vanishing into the night. The next morning, Mary Higgins arrives at the station. Perfect timing, don't you think? And then, just like that, Mary Higgins vanishes, and the whole village is up in arms searching for her. Now, where do you think she is?" Miss Marple asked pointedly, her gaze never leaving the inspector's face. Slack hesitated for a moment before muttering, "Where?" Miss Marple leaned in, her voice low and intense. "I'll tell you where you'll find her, Inspector. On Miss Emily Skinner's sofa. Get her fingerprints and you'll see I'm right." Slack blinked, his mind racing. "You're suggesting—" "Yes, I'm suggesting they're a couple of clever thieves, the Skinners, and no doubt they've got a partner, some sort of fence or handler working with them," she said. "But they won't get away with it this time, not on my watch. I'm not going to let one of our village girls, Gladys Holmes, have her character tarnished like that. She's as honest as the day is long, and everyone's going to know it." Before Inspector Slack could respond, Miss Marple straightened, giving him a pointed look. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she said with a touch of finality. Then, With that quiet confidence that had grown so familiar to the people of St. Mary Mead, she turned and walked out, leaving the inspector to stew in his disbelief. Inspector Slack muttered to himself, "I wonder if she's right." The thought lingered in his mind, an itch he couldn't scratch. But before long he found out that Miss Marple had, once again, been right. Colonel Melchett congratulated Slack on his efficiency, the case wrapped up, and the village breathed a collective sigh of relief. As for Gladys, Miss Marple invited her to tea with Edna, offering the young maid advice on settling into a good situation once she found one. Gladys smiled gratefully, though it was clear that Miss Marple's words were far from simple pleasantries. They were lessons for the future, handed down with the precision of someone who had seen much more than her fair share of life's peculiarities. So, that was the Brooch Conspiracy by Agatha Christie, the narrator's voice picked up, warm and reflective. I've been diving into a few of Agatha Christie's stories recently, and trust me, it's no coincidence. I've got a bit of a theme going on. Someone suggested it, and I thought, why not? I could dive into Sherlock Holmes, or Lord Peter Wimsey, or even get into the gritty world of Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and the likes of Philip Marlowe. Could do a whole month of that, couldn't I? But for now, we're sticking with Christie. He chuckled lightly, shaking his head. I've interrupted my Christie spree with a bit of Lord Peter Wimsey, but this story, The Case of the Perfect Maid, it first saw the light of day in 1942, published in the Strand magazine, and then in the Chicago Sunday Tribune. It later found its way into Three Blind Mice and Other Stories, and finally in Miss Marple's Final Cases. It's been reprinted numerous times, but it's still such a sweet little gem of a story. The more I read Christie, the more I realize I've taken her for granted in my adult life, and that's a shame. He paused thoughtfully. Christie's wit, though. It's like Jane Austen's in a way. Now don't get me wrong, the themes of Austen's novels aren't exactly groundbreaking, but her wit? That's something else. The way she skewers people, subtly poking fun, all while making astute observations about human nature. It's the same with Christie. We've all encountered neurotic people, right? And in this case, she uses that classic trope of the hypochondriac. You'd think, oh, it's just another one of those stories where the hypochondriac is faking it. But no. Christie pulls a double bluff on us. It's all smoke and mirrors. The narrator's tone shifted slightly, a knowing gleam in his voice. It's a brilliant misdirection. The hypochondriac is a red herring, leading us to believe one thing while the real trick is happening right under our noses. It's a conjurer's sleight of hand. I don't know about you, but I was caught off guard. I didn't figure it out until about 4/5 of the way through, and when the pieces finally clicked, well, let's just say it was a satisfying, aha moment. He smiled, almost as if in admiration. And then, of course, there's Miss Marple. She's clever, isn't she? Always one step ahead, always seeing what others miss. That's why, even though she's often underestimated, she ends up saving the day, like a quiet force of nature. Miss Marple, with her sharp wit, dropped the final piece of the puzzle like a seasoned magician revealing the trick. "It's just like the stick of rock," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You know, the sugary treat, thin, long cylinders that have words running through them. You break a piece off, and suddenly, there it is. Blackpool is a great seaside resort in sugar lettering." Inspector Slack looked at her quizzically. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple?" She gave a little shrug, her voice light. "Oh, it's a bit of a strange comparison, I suppose. It's that exactness, the way the words are embedded right through the candy. You snap it, and there they are, clear as day. But the real trick? It's not just the candy, it's the illusion it creates, just like the misdirection in the case." Inspector Slack blinked, slowly catching on. "Ah, you're saying we were looking in the wrong places." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied, her smile playful yet knowing. "You see, back when I was younger, we'd go to the seaside and there would always be a bag of rock. Ruined my teeth, of course, but it was all part of the fun. You'd see the word Blackpool right through the whole stick, sugar and letters together, inseparable. But the trick was never in the candy itself. It was in making you believe the candy was the most important thing when, in reality, it was the simplicity of the design that fooled you." Slack couldn't help but smile at her analogy, the pieces of the mystery falling into place. "So, you were right all along." "Of course," Miss Marple said with a wink. "The story was all in the details, just like the rock. We were too distracted by the obvious, while the real trick was happening behind the scenes." The narrator, shifting to commentary mode, let out a small laugh, leaning back. "Isn't that clever? The Brooch Conspiracy isn't just about a maid or a brooch. It's about understanding the quiet trickery of the human mind. Christie's ability to weave in these layers and misdirections, just like the stick of rock, is what makes her a master of the crime genre." He paused, almost reflective. "When you think of the queens of crime, it's hard not to put Christie in the same category as the other greats, isn't it? She wasn't just writing mysteries, she was painting with words, every detail, every character, placed just so, all to lead you down a path you thought you knew, only to pull the rug out from under you. It's pure genius." He smiled softly, almost nostalgic. "I don't have any grand theories or clever conclusions to offer here, just a simple acknowledgement of her brilliance. Sometimes it's just about enjoying the story for what it is, a perfect, well-constructed puzzle."